Well, good evening, First Baptist Church of Jasper, Georgia. Welcome for Wednesday night Bible study. This is the last night we're going to be in this series of parables and these ancient storytelling method that Jesus used to talk about the kingdom of God. Not something complex or big or systematic theology, but just simple stories. But yet these simple stories were rich with meaning. So they're going to be, we find them in Luke chapter 15, and we also find this same parable in Matthew chapter 18. So we're going to look at these passages. We're going to compare notes and look at them, see how they're similar, see how they're different, and then wrestle with them and just see what is within the text. So I invite you. We're going to go looking at Matthew chapter 18 first. This is verses 10 through 14. So the passage in Matthew is a little bit shorter than the one in Luke. And so as we think about those relatable concrete images that Jesus used in his ancient storytelling method, these images that we're going to find in this passage are sheep and caretakers of sheep, and this reference to little ones. So when we had this idea of this, people could relate because they lived in an agrarian society, this audience of his. So they either had sheep, or they knew someone had sheep, or maybe they were involved in taking care of sheep. And these little ones, this was something that was often talked about, not as children, but little ones were often the ones on the fringes of society, the ones who people often overlooked, people who folks might have considered less than. So let's start with verse 10 in Matthew. So Jesus begins talking here. Take care that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you, in heaven their angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven. So he first off, he begins to give a command about these little ones, and they're in the society. Whoever's listening, Jesus is beginning to talk to them, saying, this is what I want you to pay attention to. I want you to take care of these people. Verse 12, what do you think? So he kind of turns it on his audience here. If a shepherd has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountain and go in search of one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So he asks a question. He presents a situation to this group of people about the idea of if they have 100 sheep and one of them runs away. Now I can imagine the conventional wisdom of the day, probably of one who takes care of sheep. If one ran away and they had 99 there left, I would imagine they're not going to run off and try to grab that one and leave the 99 for people to come and take, for another animal to come and attack. And so this idea that the shepherd goes and grabs that one, but just pushes aside the 99 for a minute to get it. And then when they find it, usually, when your dog has run off, one of your animals has run off, and you find it, you're relieved, but you're mad at it. I remember popping my dog one time several times with a newspaper when he'd run off. That I was not happy when I found him. So I wasn't kind of rejoicing, I was more or less relieved. But this passage, the caretaker of the sheep is rejoicing that he was able to find it. So imagine what the listeners began to think. Verse 14, here's this final one. So it is not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. So Jesus goes back to this reference after the talk about sheep, back to the little ones. So Jesus was using the sheep as a metaphor for these little ones. I'm saying this is how I want it. This is how I want you to think about these folks. So now that we've worked through that passage, let's go over to Luke chapter 15, the parable of the lost sheep. And this, like I said, this is a little bit longer passage. Verses 1 through 7. I'm going to read the first couple of verses. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. So we know some of the audience. But then the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling, saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So the Pharisees and the scribes, we don't know if they were close by or if they were just paying attention to where Jesus was and the company that he kept, or they were kind of maybe immersed to the side next to them as Jesus begins to interact with these people. But these Pharisees, they are concerned, they're bothered by the company that Jesus is keeping, these sinners and these tax collectors, and that he eats with them. So this idea that the Pharisees and the scribes had, that people like them didn't eat with folks like them, and they kind of considered Jesus someone who was more like them. So here we go, verse 3. So he told them this parable. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulder and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." So he tells the story in a little bit different of a way. The idea of the sheep runs off. The caretaker of the sheep, the shepherd, runs and finds it. But the difference is that not only does the shepherd rejoice, but he calls his neighbors and all the people around, and he calls them together, and it's like, let's come and celebrate. Come to my home and celebrate that I have found this one sheep that's ran away. It's a little bit different. So, and then in verse 7, he says, "So I tell you that there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance." So, in this passage, he kind of gets pretty tongue-in-cheek with these scribes and these Pharisees. He kind of calls them out in a gentle way of saying that these very pious folks who have this set boundaries, that they only interact with certain people, they only see certain people of having worth. So he calls them out. And where in Matthew, it's more or less he's talking to a group, it seems like, where it's more saying, care for these little ones, care for these ones who are on the margins, on the bottom, where he's talking right to the Pharisees here. So we just to kind of close with just some thoughts. There's something lost. There are several parables where there's something that's lost. There's treasures, there's pearls, there's coins that are lost, and now the sheep. So this idea of finding something that's lost, that Jesus has this concern and values. Things are not easily seen, and not just things, but people who are often looked over, who are passed over, who are considered not as important, maybe not in the community's eyes of having much value. The little ones, the sinners, the tax collectors, that would probably be the same if the same type of language that. So the ones who are powerless, the ones who are on the bottom, who were often seen in the world of the first century Jew, clean and unclean. These were people that were probably considered immoral, unclean. And Jesus was extremely defensive and protective of these people. And so I want us to begin to think about the people in our herd, the people who we run with, the people that we care for, that we value, and who is precious. And if we began to see one of those folks in our herd probably start to venture out, start to wander off, we would go and we would find them and bring them back and be relieved. But in this passage, maybe Jesus is trying to get us to think bigger than our herd, the people who we eat with, that we do life with, that we're comfortable with, but begin to make us think about who are the people that we're often overlooked, that are forgotten about, that we possibly even ignore, folks that we don't like, that we don't agree with, that make us uncomfortable by who they are, by what they do, or maybe what's happened in the past, but that we see those people with as much value and concern as we do the people in our own herd. And that we find as much joy bringing them back into our herd. Or maybe there's stragglers or strangers or people that don't really have one, to find that joy of bringing those people back into community. The parables were always about pushing back on conventional wisdom of the time. And so as the Pharisees, as the scribes, as the people that were listening, as they were thinking about conventional wisdom, what was it doing? And we have to begin to think about this passage as we read these two. What conventional wisdom that we carry, that we hold on today, that we might value too much, that needs to be pushed back on, that we might need to rethink. So read back over the passages, wrestle with the text, look at the both ones in Matthew and Luke, and just see and what is it pushing back on our current environment, where we need to begin to rethink things. So that kind of ends the study on the parables. The next 2 weeks, as we go into Christmas, we are going to be looking at the shocking sayings of Jesus. Jesus said some kind of off-the-wall things that you probably are not going to hear me preach about on a Sunday morning, because they're a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, to where maybe in a setting like this we can chew on them and talk about them in a little bit easier, or not easier way, but just in a more informal type setting. So the shocking sayings of Jesus, I'm going to leave you with that. I'm not going to tell you what they are. So maybe you can begin to think about, what shocking things did Jesus say? Because there were a few. So we're just gonna pick a couple, and we're gonna go and we're gonna wrestle with them, and to try to make sense of them. And we're just gonna, like I said, try. And so, thank you so much for joining me tonight. And it's good to be together, and look forward to seeing you next Wednesday night for the shocking sayings of Jesus. Good night.